It was September 2014 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into northern Arizona, near the edge of the Coconino National Forest. I was 32 at the time, and I'd been working in construction for nearly 10 years. That month had been especially rough, long shifts, tight deadlines, and back-to-back concrete pours. I needed time away from people, phones, traffic, and work. So I loaded up my old Ford Explorer with gear and supplies and drove 5 hours north from Phoenix. I wasn't looking for a popular campsite with paved roads or running water. I wanted real isolation. I had an old topographic map and used it to find a section of forest where I figured I could pull the SUV off a dirt fire road and hike in about a mile. The idea was to set up camp near a narrow creek I saw on the map, hidden away in a valley that didn't show any nearby trails or marked campsites. The drive out there was uneventful, though the road started to get rough about 30 minutes off the main highway. By the time I reached a small turnout where I parked, it was already late afternoon. I grabbed my pack, locked up the vehicle, and started the hike in. The woods were thick with ponderosa pines and scrub oak, and the ground was covered with dry needles and loose rock. The silence was deep. I didn't hear any people or even distant cars, just wind moving through the branches. I followed the terrain downward for about an hour and reached the creek, which was barely flowing. It was enough to filter and drink from, though, and I found a flat spot near a rock outcrop that offered some natural cover and shade. I set up my small dome tent and made a fire ring with stones. It felt good to be away from everything. I hadn't seen a single soul since leaving the main road. I ate jerky and trail mix, boiled some water for tea, and sat by the fire until the stars were out in full. That first night, everything was calm. The only thing I noticed was a coyote in the distance, howling once around midnight. It didn't bother me. I'd grown up in Utah and spent a lot of time outdoors. Wildlife noises were normal. I slept hard that night. The second day was quiet too. I hiked around the valley, followed the creek for a couple of miles, and saw some old elk tracks and what looked like bear scat, but nothing fresh. I made a fire that evening, cooked some canned stew, and sat on a flat rock watching the trees sway in the wind. Just before sunset, I had a strange feeling, like I was being watched. It wasn't strong, just a little flicker of discomfort. I scanned the tree line around me but saw nothing. I figured I was just letting the isolation get to me. That night, I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. I wasn't sure why at first. I was just lying there in my sleeping bag, staring at the dark fabric of the tent above me, heart thudding. I hadn't heard a noise, but my body felt alert, like it knew something was wrong before my mind caught up. I held my breath and listened. There was a sound, faint, far off, like a dry branch cracking. Then silence. I thought maybe it was a deer moving through the brush, or maybe that same coyote from the night before. I didn't leave the tent. I lay still for what felt like an hour, eyes wide open in the darkness, until I finally drifted back to sleep. The third day, I felt uneasy. I still didn't see any people, but I started noticing small things out of place. A sharp stone sitting on the flat rock where I'd been sitting the night before, shaped like an arrowhead but too rough to be man-made. A set of deep footprints on the opposite side of the creek, far from any trail. They looked human, but the stride was long and the toes were weird, almost splayed out wider than normal. I told myself it was probably just someone hiking barefoot. Not common, but not impossible. Maybe some survivalist type. I tried to shrug it off and spent the afternoon fishing in the creek. Caught nothing. That night, I didn't build a fire. Something about the light made me feel exposed. I ate a cold meal and got into the tent early. The wind had died down completely, and the woods were too quiet. No rustling, no crickets, no night birds, just dead stillness. Sometime after midnight, I woke up again. This time I knew exactly what had pulled me out of sleep. There was something moving outside the tent. I could hear it. Slow steps crunching dry leaves. Not circling the tent, just moving nearby. Then it stopped. I waited, breathing as lightly as I could, hoping it was just a deer sniffing around. But then I heard a sound that froze me completely. It was a voice, not words, not a sentence, just a broken, low sound, a voice trying to mimic something. It was long and drawn out, like someone imitating the sound of a groan. Came from about 10 feet behind the tent, and it didn't sound right. The tone was off. It didn't carry emotion or rhythm, just a broken human-like noise, like someone trying to speak but not understanding how. I didn't move. Then came another sound, closer. This time it was like a whisper. My name. Only it wasn't my name. It was close, just off by a letter or two, like someone trying to say it after only hearing it once, maybe years ago. I hadn't spoken to anyone since I'd arrived. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. To first light, I packed everything, fast. I didn't bother making food or boiling water. I shoved my gear into the backpack, broke down the tent in minutes, and started moving back uphill toward where I'd left the Explorer. I expected to feel better once I left the creek bed and started climbing out of the valley. But I didn't. In fact, it got worse. The woods felt heavier, like something was pushing down on the air. About halfway back to the car, I stopped dead in my tracks. On a tree about 20 yards ahead of me, I saw a strip of fabric hanging off a low branch. It was the same pattern and color as my shirt. I recognized it instantly, green plaid with a tear near the button line. I checked myself. My shirt was intact. I'd never lost any piece of it. That cloth wasn't mine. I didn't go near it. I walked wide, keeping distance, eyes scanning everything. When I reached the dirt road, I ran the last 100 yards to the vehicle. I unlocked it with shaky hands and got in, locking the doors immediately. I sat there for a moment before starting the engine, staring into the trees. I didn't see anything. No person, no animal, no shape, but I could feel something back there, watching, still watching. I drove straight out of the forest without stopping once, not even for food or gas. I made it to a motel 3 hours south and stayed there that night. I didn't unpack anything until the next day. When I did, I noticed something else. One of my spare shirts, the same green plaid one, was missing. I never went back to that part of Arizona. I don't go camping alone anymore. I don't even go deep into the woods unless I know others are nearby. I never saw anything clear. Never saw a creature or a monster or anything you'd put in a movie. But something was there. Something that knew I was there, watched me for days and tried to sound like me. Like a person. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a myth. It was something that knew how to hide and how to mimic, just not perfectly. And I think it took something from me. Not just the shirt. Something else. I've tried not to think too hard about it since. But every now and then, I hear that broken voice again in my dreams, trying to sound human, but just not getting it right. And every time it gets a little bit closer. I went camping alone in the summer of 2013. I was 29, working in construction at the time, and had just finished a long job in Tulsa, Oklahoma. My back ached, my head felt full of dust, and I needed some quiet. I'd done solo camping trips before, but mostly in more popular places, Yosemite, Smokies, once near Lake George. This time, I decided to head into the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas. Less crowded, deeper woods, fewer tourists. That's what I wanted, quiet, space to breathe. I left early on a Thursday morning, packed up my Ford Escape with gear I trusted. A big green tent I'd had for 5 years, a small but tough cooler, my old lantern, and some simple food, canned soup, jerky, bread, and coffee. I brought a water jug, a small folding chair, and a hand axe too. I didn't plan on hiking much. I just wanted to park somewhere off a forest road, set up camp for 2 or 3 days, and sit in peace. By mid-afternoon, I was deep in the woods. I turned off Route 63 and followed a gravel road that wasn't on the map. I drove about 10 or 11 miles in. The road narrowed and became more like a trail, just 2-tire ruts with brush in the middle. I passed one parked truck that looked abandoned. No sign of people. I kept going. I found a clearing not far from a dry creek bed. The trees were tall, mostly pines and hickories, and the ground was flat enough for my tent. I set up quickly. Tent first, then gathered some wood, started a small fire, and made soup. No cell signal, but that was expected. I turned off my phone, stuck it in my backpack, and focused on the quiet. Felt good. The woods were thick, full of cicadas and birds.
No planes overhead.
Just trees, bugs, and the occasional rustle in the brush. I saw no one that day. That night, the sky turned dark fast. There wasn't much moonlight. I kept the fire going until about 10, then crawled into my tent and zipped up. I left the rain flap open for air and lay down on my pad. I fell asleep easy, but I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, probably 2 or 3 in the morning. I don't know what made me open my eyes. There was no loud sound, nothing obvious, just a strange pressure in my chest, like a tightness that something was wrong. I stayed still and listened. The woods were quiet. Not peaceful quiet, though. Dead quiet. No bugs, no wind, no owls. That kind of silence doesn't last in the wild unless something else is nearby. I sat up slowly, listening harder. The fire was out. My tent was zipped up, and the dark outside looked thick. I felt that familiar tension in my gut, the same feeling I'd get years ago while hunting, right before I'd spot something. Then I heard it. Not close, but not far either. A slow, deliberate crunch of dry leaves. Just 1 or 2 steps. Then nothing. Then another step. It wasn't an animal. Animals move quick, scurry, or dart around. This was slow, patient. It sounded like a person walking barefoot, careful not to make noise, but not in a hurry either. Another step. Pause. Another step. I held my breath. My heart started to pound. I stayed inside the tent, listening for a few minutes, maybe longer. I finally unzipped the flap just an inch and peeked out. I couldn't see anything at first. My eyes adjusted. The trees looked like dark bones. I didn't see anyone, but I swear I felt something out there, like I was being watched. I stayed awake the rest of the night, holding my axe tight. I didn't hear more footsteps, but the silence stayed heavy. When morning came, the woods returned to normal. Birds chirped, bugs clicked. Sunlight filtered through the trees like it always did. I stepped outside, walked around the clearing. I looked for prints or any sign that someone had been close. I didn't see anything clear. Maybe I imagined it, I told myself. Maybe it was just a deer, but I didn't believe that. I should have packed up and left right then. But I didn't. I told myself I was just tired, that I'd had a long week and needed to rest. I decided to stay one more night. That was my mistake. I spent the day near the creek bed, sharpening a stick, trying to distract myself. Around noon, I noticed something strange. A piece of twine hanging from a tree about 30 yards from my camp. It was rough rope, looked old, just dangling from a low branch. It hadn't been there the day before. I walked over and looked closer. The rope was tied into a loose loop like a snare or a signal. Creeped me out. I cut it down and tossed it. Later, I walked further into the trees and saw a few more odd things. A broken bottle half buried in the dirt. A strip of torn flannel caught on bark. What really made me stop was a small pile of stones stacked near a stump. 5 stones neatly balanced, like someone had put them there on purpose. Too clean to be natural. That did it for me. I returned to camp fast. I packed up my food, doused the fire, and decided I'd leave the next morning as early as I could. But I was stuck for one more night. I didn't want to risk driving that trail in the dark. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat outside my tent with my axe and a flashlight. I didn't build a fire, didn't want to give away my position. The flashlight was off. I listened. Time passed slow. Then, close to midnight, I heard the same sound again. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. It was closer than before, maybe 30 feet away. I couldn't see anything. I clicked on my flashlight and swept it side to side. Trees, brush, nothing else. Then I heard it again, this time behind me. Fast, like someone darting behind a tree. I spun around, light shaking in my hand. Still nothing. I shouted something, don't even remember what, but no answer came. Just silence again. That awful, heavy silence. I stayed awake until dawn, not blinking much, not moving. As soon as there was light, I packed everything. I left my chair, didn't care, tossed my gear into the back of the Escape, turned around, and drove out without breakfast. The trail was rough, but I didn't stop once. My hands shook on the wheel. I didn't relax until I hit the blacktop again. A week later, back in Tulsa, I looked up stories about that part of the forest. Turns out there were a few odd reports over the years. Missing hikers, strange shelters found deep in the woods, unlicensed campsites. Nothing that made the news big, but enough to know I wasn't the only one to feel watched out there. One blog even mentioned hearing footsteps at night on that same gravel trail. Another guy found animal bones hung from trees in a pattern. No one had answers. I haven't gone back to the Washita since. I still camp, but only in places where other people are nearby. Somewhere with cell signal. Somewhere with signs and rangers. I don't know who was out there with me that night, or what their reason was for creeping through the trees. I don't want to know. All I know is someone was there, walking slow, staying just far enough to not be seen, but close enough to hear. Close enough to leave rope and stones. Watching. That kind of quiet doesn't happen on its own. And I'll never forget how it felt. It was late summer 2014 when I decided to go camping alone for the first time. I was 27 at the time, and I'd just come back from a long stretch of working shifts in London. I was tired of the city noise, the crowded trains, the same dull routine every day. I wanted space, air, and quiet. I didn't want to be around anyone. I didn't want to hear voices or traffic or phones buzzing. So I packed up a small rucksack, filled it with food, water, a first aid kit, and a few essentials, then took the train from Paddington to a small town in Gloucestershire called Colford, on the edge of the Forest of Dean. I had found a patch of forest on an old hiking map I'd picked up years ago, an area that didn't have any popular trails or campsites, just thick woods, a few old fire roads, and not much else. I arrived in the afternoon and hiked out from town with a heavy bag and a good feeling in my chest. I felt free in a way I hadn't in a long time. The air smelled like pine and damp leaves. The sun came through the trees in sharp white rays. I followed a logging trail for about an hour, then cut off into the forest, finding a small clearing just big enough for a one-man tent. It was flat and dry. I could hear birds all around and nothing else. I set up camp, cooked a basic meal on my little stove, and spent the evening writing in a notebook and just breathing. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The second day, I spent hiking. I didn't use a GPS or phone. I brought a map and compass because I wanted to do things the old-fashioned way. I walked through thick brush, found deer tracks, and even came across an old stone wall in the middle of nowhere. It looked like the remains of a farmhouse. I never saw another person that day, and I liked it that way. I came back to camp just before dusk, cooked again, and went to sleep with the sound of owls in the trees. That night, though, I woke up once. It was sometime in the early morning, maybe around 3 or 4. I had the rain fly open because it was warm out. Through the mesh of the tent, I thought I saw something move in the trees. Just a quick shape. I sat up slowly and looked for a long time. Nothing. Figured it was a deer or a fox. Still, it stuck with me a little. On the third day, I stayed near camp. My legs were sore and I wanted to rest. I read, made coffee over the stove, and just listened to the forest. Around midday, I heard a sound in the distance, branches snapping. It wasn't close, maybe 50 or 60 yards away, but it was the first unnatural sound I'd heard since getting there. It wasn't an animal walking. It sounded heavier. I stood still, trying to listen. The sound didn't continue, though, so I shook it off. Later that afternoon, I walked a bit east of my tent and found an old metal fence buried in the trees. Beyond it, there was a small mossy stone structure. Looked like a storage shed or possibly a root cellar from way back. The door was gone, just an open frame leaning inward, and the inside was full of broken glass and rotting wood. The strangest part was that there were fresh boot prints in the dirt outside. Big ones, size 12 or 13, way too big to be mine. I don't know why, but it didn't make me panic. I just felt confused, like someone had walked past days ago. Still, I didn't like the idea of someone else being out there. I made a note of the direction and went back to my tent earlier than usual. That night, the woods felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt like the trees were holding their breath. I kept my headlamp nearby and didn't open the rain fly. I laid in the tent for hours, not able to sleep. I listened to every small creak and rustle in the brush. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Not an animal, not something rustling in the undergrowth. It was the sound of weight pressing into the earth. I held my breath. The steps were slow and steady. Then they stopped. I waited for what felt like 10 minutes. Nothing. I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely hear. I sat there, back pressed against my sleeping bag, staring at the shape of the tent ceiling above me. I don't remember falling asleep. The next morning, I didn't pack up and leave like you'd think someone would. I tried to convince myself it was just someone walking through. A hiker, a forester, someone passing by. But the idea it could have been someone standing near my tent for minutes, just standing, shook me in a way I couldn't admit at the time. I stayed one more night, telling myself I wouldn't let fear ruin my trip. I set a perimeter around my camp with fishing line and small metal bottle caps, just enough to make noise if someone came near. I also moved my tent deeper into the trees, a few hundred feet away from where it had been before, hidden behind a large downed oak. I didn't light a fire that night. I didn't cook anything. I sat in the dark, watching and listening. My body was tense. My ears were sharp to every sound. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard the line snap. The bottle caps clinked. Not loudly, but enough. I stayed frozen. My hands shook. The sound of slow footsteps came again. Not rushing, not running, just slow. Deliberate. Getting closer. I didn't move a muscle. Then I saw something. There was a man standing just outside the reach of my tent. He wasn't doing anything, just standing. His silhouette was tall, broader than average. He wore a hood or maybe a coat with a high collar. I could see no light on him, no flashlight, no phone. Nothing, just a shape. Then he moved, not toward the tent, but past it. I could hear him walking, circling slowly. I didn't move for hours. I didn't sleep. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I grabbed my bag, collapsed the tent as fast as I could without making much noise, and walked out of there in a straight line. I didn't bother with the trail. I just kept walking west until I hit a small river I recognized, then followed it until I found the road. I was dirty, hungry, and exhausted. I waved down a passing car and got a ride back into Colford. I didn't say much to the driver. I just kept looking behind us out the window. I stayed in a hotel that night and caught a train the next morning back to London. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe it was a ranger or another camper who didn't want to be seen. But that doesn't make sense. Who hikes into the deep woods without a light? Walks circles around someone else's tent at 2 in the morning and doesn't say a word. I've never gone camping alone since then. Sometimes, when I'm in bed and it's quiet, I'll close my eyes and see that shape standing there, not doing anything, just standing, waiting. I told a friend about it once, just once, and he asked me if I thought the man was dangerous. I told him I didn't know, but the truth is, I didn't need him to do anything. That kind of quiet, patient watching, that was dangerous enough. It was late October 2016 when I decided to take a solo camping trip up to a place called Little Bennett Ridge in southern Oregon. I was 34 at the time, working a desk job in Eugene, burnt out from screens and fluorescent lights and emails. I had a 3-day weekend ahead of me, and I figured it was time to unplug. I packed light, just a basic tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a couple of days, and some waterproof gear. I didn't expect trouble, just a quiet weekend in the woods. The drive took around 3 hours. I didn't see another car for most of it, and the sky had been gray the entire afternoon, the kind of solid, dull gray that gives no clue if it'll rain or hold. When I reached the trailhead, it was already past 4 p.m. I hiked in about 2 miles off the official trail and found a small clearing about halfway up a ridge. It wasn't perfect, but I liked how secluded it felt. Thick pine trees surrounded it, and there was a mossy boulder that could shield one side of the tent from the wind. I set up quickly, trying to beat the light fading out of the sky. Around 6:30, the rain started. First it was soft, almost like a drizzle, barely making a sound on the tent's rainfly. But an hour later, it was coming down steady, tapping against the nylon like 1,000 fingers. I stayed dry inside, lying back on my sleeping pad, chewing on some beef jerky and staring at the ceiling of the tent, just listening. I remember feeling strangely calm. That changed around 9 p.m. By then, it was fully dark. I had my headlamp on, but I kept it dim to save the battery. The rain was still falling, harder now. I kept thinking I heard something outside. Twigs snapping, movement, but I told myself it was probably the wind or the rain hitting branches. Still, I turned the light off and just laid still, listening hard. The forest has a sound to it, even in the rain. Animals, water hitting leaves, distant rustles. But this sound wasn't distant, felt closer. I heard footsteps, not heavy, but not light either. Just slow, deliberate steps in the wet brush. I knew it wasn't an animal, not with that rhythm. Animals don't walk like that. Sounded like boots. I held my breath. The steps stopped maybe 15 feet from the tent. I couldn't see anything from inside, not with the rainfly up and the tent zipped shut. I didn't move. I just laid there, trying to keep my breathing quiet. Then I heard nothing. No more steps. Just the rain again. That silence was worse than the noise. I waited like that for maybe 15 minutes, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe just a deer passing close by. Maybe even a tree creaking. But I knew better. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept waking up at every sound. At one point, I thought I heard water sloshing, like someone stepping through a puddle near the tent. But again, it didn't come closer. Just movement out there, like someone circling. When the sky started to get lighter around 6 a.m., I finally unzipped the tent and looked around. Everything was wet, covered in a cold mist. My breath came out in thick clouds. I scanned the clearing. Nothing seemed out of place at first. Then I saw it, muddy footprints. Not animal prints, boot prints. One set. They started about 20 feet away, circled the tent once, and vanished back into the woods. My stomach turned when I saw them. They weren't mine. My boots were still inside the tent, dry. Whoever had walked around me had come in the middle of the night and stood no more than 3 feet from where I was lying. Watching, listening, I packed up in under 10 minutes. I didn't even make breakfast, just shoved everything into the pack, yanked the tent down half collapsed, and started heading down the ridge trail. My heart was pounding, and every sound in the woods felt like something following me. I didn't stop once, not even to drink water. I made it to my truck by around 8 a.m. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low, everything soaked and gray. I threw my gear in the back and didn't even change out of my wet clothes. I just drove. I should have gone home. I should have left it at that. But 2 days later, I kept thinking about those footprints. Who had been up there in the middle of nowhere? Why didn't they say anything? Why just circle my tent and disappear? So I did something stupid. I went back, not to camp, just to look. It was early in the morning when I drove back out to Little Bennett Ridge, but this time I brought a hunting knife and a small camera. I hiked back up to the same clearing, and I looked for more prints. Everything had mostly dried out, but in some of the softer patches of ground, I could see faint impressions. Old, smudged, but still there. Not mine. The sole pattern was different than my boots. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Off to the east side of the clearing, near the edge of the trees, there was an old logging road that had almost been swallowed up by brush. It didn't show on any of the maps I'd checked before. I followed it slowly for maybe a quarter mile. That's when I found the shack. It was small, almost hidden in the trees, made of rotting wood with a rusted tin roof. No windows, just a crooked door. I stood outside for a long time, just staring at it. It didn't look lived in, but it didn't look totally abandoned either. There were cigarette butts outside the door, plastic water jug, a crushed soup can, fresh. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. Someone had been staying there, probably for a while, probably still was. I backed away, slow, careful not to make noise, and returned to the trail. I never went back after that. I didn't tell anyone for a long time either, mostly because I didn't want to explain why I had gone out there alone, or why I had gone back. I just knew I didn't want to ever be near that place again. What really messed with me was realizing how far off the regular trail I had camped. I thought I was alone. I thought I was far away from anyone. But someone had been out there, living off the books, hiding, and they knew I was there. They walked around my tent in the middle of the night and left without a sound. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe they were just watching. But the worst part was realizing how easily they could have done something. I was completely exposed. Just a layer of nylon between me and whoever was out there. And I wouldn't have had a chance to stop them. Now, even years later, I still think about that night sometimes when it rains. I don't camp alone anymore. Not even in state parks. The woods don't feel quiet anymore. They feel like they're holding something just out of sight. Something that watches without ever needing to speak. It was the summer of 2018, and I still don't really know what pushed us to do it. Maybe it was the constant noise of the city or the fact that both of us had hit a mental wall at the gym, like we needed something different to snap out of the same routines. My gym partner, Jake, had just broken up with his girlfriend of 3 years, and I was getting sick of my apartment and everything in it. We figured a weekend out in nature would help. Nothing fancy, just a quick 2-night camp trip somewhere out of reach. Jake found a spot online called Linton Hollow, just north of Lake Idaway in Washington. It wasn't an official campground. It wasn't even listed on most maps. Some guy had posted about it on a hiking forum, saying it was remote, quiet, and surrounded by pine forest for miles. Perfect for disconnecting, he said. The pictures looked nice. Empty fire pits, an overgrown trail, tall trees so thick they swallowed the sky. We packed light, tent, food, water, knives, flashlight, gear bags, and drove up early Friday morning. It took nearly 5 hours to get there, with the last 40 minutes on some half-forgotten gravel road that wound through dense woods and looked like it hadn't been driven on in a decade. Jake was driving, and we didn't say much as the trees grew taller and the road rougher. By the time we parked and got our bags out, there was nothing around but trees, bugs, and the muffled hush of a forest that hadn't heard cars in years. I remember the feeling hitting me then, like we were somewhere we weren't supposed to be, but I pushed it down. Jake seemed excited, and I wasn't going to be the one to kill the vibe before we even pitched the tent. It took us about 30 minutes to find a flat patch near the edge of a shallow gully and set everything up. The trail had disappeared behind us, swallowed by wild growth, and the car was maybe a 25-minute walk back the way we came. It was hot, but not unbearable. Quiet. No wind. No birds. No real sound except the occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves. We ate around 6 p.m., grilled some stuff over a small fire, and talked about usual things. Lifting routines, work, dumb stuff. I remember Jake mentioning he hadn't had decent sleep in weeks and was looking forward to crashing early. The sky turned orange and then gray, and the trees turned to black shapes pressing in on us from every side. That first night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to sounds I couldn't place. There were movements, small, short bursts of something walking too close to the tent and then stopping. I tried to tell myself it was deer, maybe a raccoon. I had my knife next to me, and I gripped it tight every time the sound came back. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a sick, tight feeling in my gut that wouldn't leave. Jake was out cold, snoring quietly beside me, which made it worse somehow, like he didn't hear any of it, or maybe didn't want to. The second day started slow. We went for a short hike toward the ridge behind the gully. There was no trail to follow anymore, just rocks, roots, and uneven slopes. It was hard work, and I kept having to stop to swat mosquitoes or catch my breath. Jake kept pushing forward like he needed to get somewhere, even though there wasn't a destination. We found what looked like an old deer blind built up in a tree, just broken wood nailed into branches. There were old cans on the ground beneath it, rusted and caked with moss. I don't know how long they'd been there, but they didn't look like they'd been touched in years. The wind picked up that afternoon. Not strong, but enough to bring in dark clouds and a stillness that made the woods feel heavier. By the time we got back to camp, the air had gone damp and gray. Rain started around 6 p.m. Not heavy, but steady, the kind that seeps into everything. The firewood was already damp from the air, and we struggled to get anything lit. We ate cold granola bars in the tent, sitting in the dull yellow light of a battery lamp. Around midnight, the real storm started. Rain hit the tent like nails, loud and fast, and the wind made the trees moan and snap. Branches broke somewhere nearby. Couldn't sleep. Jake rolled over and groaned a few times but stayed out. I kept thinking I was hearing something under the rain. A wet footstep, a cough, breathing. Then I heard what sounded like someone tapping on the side of the tent. Just one tap and then silence. I sat up and waited, not moving. Another tap, closer to my head this time. I didn't move for a long time. Knife in hand, breath held, listening harder than I've ever listened. But there was nothing, just rain and wind and that feeling in my stomach like something was wrong, like something was near. Eventually, I must have dozed off because I woke up to daylight. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soaked, and the tent smelled like wet nylon and sweat. Jake was already outside, crouching low near the trees behind our camp. I got out and walked over. He didn't say anything. He was staring at the ground. There were footprints, not ours. Barefoot, wide set, pressed deep into the mud. At least 6 of them, coming in from the trees and stopping just 10 feet from our tent. They weren't big, but they were wrong. Toes spread wider than normal, and the prints were long, almost like someone with double-jointed feet. The steps were too far apart to be casual. like someone had been running or jumping. We didn't talk about it. We packed up fast, not even bothering to eat. Every 5 minutes, we checked the trees. We didn't say it out loud, but we both felt it. Whatever had been there wasn't an animal. It wasn't lost. It had come straight to our camp and stopped just short of us, and then left. By the time we got back to the car, the sun was climbing, and everything felt a little safer. But the feeling didn't leave. That tight, gnawing unease stayed with me the entire drive home and into the next few days. I didn't sleep right for almost a week after. Jake went quiet after that trip. He stopped coming to the gym. I messaged him a few times and even dropped by his place once, but he wasn't around. I later found out he'd moved out of state. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. I don't know what we saw or who was out there that night, but I've replayed it in my head 1,000 times. The way the prince came right up to the edge of our camp, stopped, and then vanished back into the woods, like someone watching, waiting. That was the last time I went camping. Every now and then I think about going again, but I never do. I still work out. I still live in the same place. But part of me never left that forest. Part of me still listens for footsteps in the rain. And I'll never forget how those prints looked. Not like human, not like animal, just wrong. Like something pretending to be both. It was the middle of October 2013. I was 27 back then, living in a small flat in Sheffield, England. At that time, I had just started taking more weekend trips to get out of the city. I'd gotten into the habit of doing solo camping to clear my head after work. It wasn't about the wilderness or being deep in nature for me. I just wanted quiet. I didn't even go far. I'd camp in farmers' fields with permission, or sometimes in abandoned places where no one cared. That weekend, I picked something different. I'd seen a post online about an old graveyard just outside of a town called Baslow. It wasn't on any tourist map or anything official. It had been closed down since the 1950s. The headstones were cracked, overgrown, and half buried in thick grass. I read someone say there were still iron fences bent into the ground, like they were trying to keep something in. That part stuck with me. I didn't believe in anything paranormal or weird like that. I liked being alone, and camping near an old graveyard that most people didn't even remember sounded like it would be peaceful, if a bit strange. So that Friday after work, I packed my usual stuff. A single-man tent, a roll mat, sleeping bag, gas stove, and a small folding chair, and I drove out towards Baslow. It took about an hour and a half. The graveyard was behind a collapsed stone wall, hidden under tall pine trees. The clearing had a strange shape to it, not a perfect square or rectangle, just uneven, like nature was trying to eat it but hadn't finished. I parked my car about 500 yards away down a dirt path and hiked the rest. There wasn't a single person around. The whole area felt forgotten.
No signposts, no markings.
The only thing that gave it away were the old gates, still standing but rusted through in places. I walked in slowly, not because I was scared, but because the ground was uneven and I didn't want to twist my ankle. I picked a spot in the far corner, away from the gates and the more obvious gravestones. I didn't want to disrespect anything, and truthfully, I didn't want to wake up staring at a headstone 2 feet away. I pitched the tent and set up my chair. It was still light when I finished. Late afternoon, but the sun was already sliding behind the trees. I heated a small can of soup and sat there, eating quietly, listening to the birds. After the sun dipped fully, the whole place dropped into darkness faster than I expected.
No streetlights.
No traffic, just the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I stayed up until about 9, just watching the little flame on my stove and trying not to let my mind wander. The thing about camping in a graveyard, even if you don't believe in anything, is that your imagination does the work for you. I kept thinking I was hearing footsteps or voices far off, but when I turned off the stove and the last bit of light disappeared, all I could hear was my own breathing. I zipped myself into the tent, laid back, and tried to sleep. Around 1 in the morning, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, just this slow, dragging sound. Not something sharp like a branch snapping. It was softer, repeating. I held my breath. I thought maybe an animal, badger or fox, was wandering nearby. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound came again. A slow shuffle, like something dragging across the ground. It didn't feel right. It was too slow. And it was close, maybe 10 feet from the tent. I didn't have any weapons, just a small folding knife I'd used to open my can earlier. I kept it next to me just in case. I didn't move. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. The dragging noise paused. Then I heard a soft thud. Then another. It sounded like someone was dropping a bag of soil in short bursts. Not heavy enough for footsteps, but too deliberate to be an animal. I turned slowly onto my side and listened harder. The next noise was what froze me. A cough. Not a loud, throat-clearing cough, but a short, dry one. Close. Human. My skin turned cold instantly. My tent was zipped shut, and I had no light on, but whoever was outside had to know I was there. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to make a sound. I just waited. The coughing stopped, and the dragging started again, moving away now, in a crooked path across the uneven ground. I stayed awake until dawn. I didn't sleep a second after that. At first light, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The cold morning air hit me fast. There was dew on everything, and my tent had small leaves stuck to it like someone had brushed past during the night. I looked around, not expecting to find anything, but I was wrong. Near one of the tilted headstones, about 15 feet from where I'd set up camp, the grass had been flattened. Not trampled, not like someone ran through. More like something had been dragged. The ground had this thick trail of disturbed earth, like a shovel had been pulled through it sideways. At the end of the trail was a patch of loose soil, like someone had tried to dig something shallow and stopped halfway. There were scuff marks everywhere, scratches in the dirt, as if something heavy had been shifted around. It didn't make sense. I didn't take photos. I didn't want to document it. I just packed my things and left. I walked the entire way back to my car without looking back once. About a week later, I went online to look up more about that graveyard. I wanted some logical explanation. Maybe it was a caretaker, maybe some older person still visiting family. But nothing came up. No recent burials. No maintenance crew. Just old posts from years ago talking about how the place was abandoned. Someone had written in a forum thread that a local farmer used to leave dead sheep at the edge of it when they died of illness, but even that story felt like a stretch. I thought about going back the next weekend, but I never did. Something about the way the dragging had sounded, the cough, and that half-dug patch in the dirt stayed with me too long. It wasn't fear of ghosts. It was the fact that someone real had been there, moving through that graveyard in the dark, unbothered by my presence, not talking, not shining any lights, just dragging something through the grass and coughing. It's been years since that night. I still camp alone now and then, but never near graves. I don't even like walking past cemeteries anymore. I know what I heard. I know what I saw. I don't need to make it into something supernatural, but someone was out there, dragging something heavy through that dead grass, and they didn't care that I was just feet away in a thin tent, listening to every sound. I don't want to know what they were doing. I don't want to know what was under that patch of disturbed soil. I just know I'm lucky they didn't come any closer. It was late September 2017. I was 31 at the time, living in Oxfordshire, and going through one of those phases where I needed to get away from everything. I had broken up with someone earlier that summer, and work was draining me in ways I didn't even realize until I'd stop and feel my jaw clenching for no reason. So I started spending weekends alone in the countryside, mostly just hiking, sketching, sleeping outdoors, and shutting off my phone. That Friday, I left straight from work around 4 p.m., drove north toward the Peak District, and planned to set up camp near a quarry I'd marked on a topo map earlier that week. It wasn't some touristy hiking spot with signs or paved trails. It was just something I had spotted from satellite maps. A large old limestone quarry tucked between a thick patch of woods and rolling hills with very little foot traffic nearby. The weather had been holding steady for days, and the forecast was clear. I parked the car on a quiet gravel pull-off about 2 kilometers from the site, threw on my pack, and made the hike in as the sun started to dip behind the hills. I reached the spot just before sunset. The quarry was larger than I expected, maybe 200 meters across, with jagged rock walls that dropped down steep into a wide, uneven basin with cracked stone, some standing water, and scattered bushes and weeds pushing up through crevices. It was beautiful in its own way, remote, silent. I remember thinking the place had a strange stillness to it. Not eerie, just hollow, like it had been untouched for years. I set up my small tent near the edge of the basin, on a slightly raised ridge with a view over the whole quarry floor. Behind me was a line of trees and the beginning of thick woods. In front of me was the steep slope leading down into the quarry. I boiled some pasta on my small camp stove, ate, and laid back to watch the last of the light fade out of the sky. That first night was uneventful, quiet. I heard a few distant animal sounds in the woods. Some owls, maybe a fox, but nothing that gave me pause. I woke up once around 3 a.m. to pee, stepped out of the tent, and was struck by how dark it was.
No moon. No distant lights.
Just that black, thick countryside darkness that eats up everything outside your headlamp beam. I slept again until about 8 a.m. and woke up refreshed. I made coffee, sat on a flat boulder, and just listened. It's strange how loud silence can get when you're completely alone. Your ears start to fill in the gaps with stuff that probably isn't even there. Footsteps that aren't, voices that never speak. I brushed it off and spent most of the day hiking a loop through the forest on the far side of the quarry, looking for mushrooms and interesting rocks to bring back and sketch. That evening, something started to feel a little off. It wasn't anything big, just a few small things stacked together. First, when I returned to my tent, I noticed a couple small rocks scattered outside the flap. Not large ones, just 2 or 3 round, smooth like river stones. I hadn't noticed them there before. They weren't the kind of rocks I'd seen in the quarry either. These looked like they'd been placed there. I figured maybe they'd been kicked up when I was unpacking or tossed aside when I cleared the ground for my tent. I ignored it. I made some rice and beans, ate, read for a bit, then zipped up inside my tent. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. Not a branch snapping or anything sudden, more like a soft scraping. I froze and just listened. Came again. Something dragging lightly over stone, maybe 20 or 30 meters away, toward the quarry floor. I stayed still, breathing shallow, ears wide open. It stopped. Then a few minutes later, the sound of gravel shifting. That kind of noise you hear when someone takes a slow, deliberate step on loose stone. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. I didn't hear it again. I convinced myself it was a deer or a badger nosing around and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I went to the edge of the slope and looked down into the basin. That's when I saw it. A single boot print in the dust at the bottom of the quarry. It was faint but clear. The quarry didn't have any formal trails. It wasn't public land. No one had any reason to be out there. I hadn't seen a soul since I parked the car. I told myself someone had probably just wandered out here the day before, maybe from a nearby village or farm, though I hadn't passed anything inhabited for at least an hour's drive. Still, it got in my head. I packed up my bag and started walking out, but halfway down the trail I stopped. I don't know why. Something told me to check the map again. My car was still a good 1.5 kilometers away, and I had this sick thought. What if someone followed me out here and waited until I was asleep? I turned around and looked behind me, scanning the woods. I didn't see anything, but I didn't like the feeling. I picked up my pace. About 5 minutes later, I heard something that made my stomach drop. It was the sound of footsteps behind me. Fast, light, then stopping. I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing. The trail was empty. No movement in the trees. No sound. I waited. Still nothing. So I started moving faster. Not quite running, but quick enough that I could feel my legs burning after a while. I reached the gravel pull-off and my car was there. No broken windows. No signs of tampering. I threw my bag in the back, got in, and locked the doors immediately. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there for a minute, gripping the wheel, trying to slow my breathing. That's when I saw it. In the tree line, maybe 40 meters back, just beyond where the path met the woods, there was a figure, standing still. I could barely make out the shape, just enough to tell it was a man. Not moving, not walking, just standing, watching. I turned the key and reversed out so fast I almost clipped a tree. I didn't stop driving until I hit the motorway. I didn't even check the rearview mirror much. I didn't want to see anything. I didn't report it. What would I even say? That I went camping on public land, heard a few noises, and maybe saw someone? I hadn't been attacked. Nothing had been taken. I was just some guy out in the woods with a too active imagination. Still, I never camped alone after that. I've tried to rationalize it so many times. Maybe it was a hiker. Maybe a local who didn't like people trespassing. Maybe some bored teenager trying to scare someone. But none of that explains the rock outside my tent. The boot print. The sound of someone walking on gravel in the middle of the night. The figure standing dead still in the trees. It's not the kind of thing that ruins your life, but it sticks. It makes you feel like you were prey for a little while, like something could have gone very wrong if you hadn't left when you did. I don't think whoever it was wanted to be seen, and I don't think I was the first person they watched out there.